Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University and all of us at Academia SG, welcome to our next installment of our Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series. Character and citizenship education in Singapore has excited a lot of controversy recently, which just goes to show how seriously Singaporeans take the role of schools in molding the values of their children. So we're especially pleased today to welcome Jeremy Siow, who's a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in Quantitative Political Science at the University of Oxford, to share his research on CCE and its role in cultivating ethnic tolerance. We are equally delighted to have as our discussant Professor Lee Ching Ho, Professor of Social Studies Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Without further ado, let me welcome Jeremy Siow to share his work.
Thank you, Cherian, for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I believe that there are many people who are in Singapore or in Asia, and so this is a kind of late time for everyone to be up, so I'm really thankful for everyone to be here. Let me just share my slides so that y'all can see what's going on. Okay. Can everyone see the transition? Okay, sounds good. All right. So before I begin, I think I want to emphasize that this project looks at, well, Cherian calls it character and citizenship education, and I think that's a concept that is very familiar within the Singapore context. For this paper that I'm presenting, I am looking at it from a more general and cross-national angle. And so I wouldn't be labeling it specifically as character and citizenship education, but rather I'll just call it in the more general term, which is in the education and political science circles will be called civic and citizenship education. So to begin with, there has been a lot of attention dedicated towards understanding the effects stemming from exposure to civic and citizenship education. And this rich set of literature has found that civic and citizenship education, or CCE in short, affects a multitude of attitudes and behaviors. So in terms of outcomes, we know that exposure to CCE increases the likelihood that someone would turn out to vote, increases one's political knowledge and efficacy, and as well as reducing one's tendency to engage in authoritarian nostalgia. Not only in terms of the wide variety of outcomes that CCE has, CCE also applies to a variety of contexts, and it's been shown that CCE has the same kind of effects, both in established as well as new democracies, and across varying modalities, such as in-person or even through online channels. And also, one of the more intriguing part is that CCE affects or impacts not only adults and children, but it has a compensatory effect on individuals coming from marginalized groups, in that it is able to help them to catch up to the more privileged peers in terms of political efficacy, political knowledge, as well as political participation. But however, despite this this extensive attention paid towards CCE's impact on political outcomes, it is not very well known or understood that about CCE's effect on intergroup tolerance. Regardless, I think intuitively we think that CCE might still have a positive impact in fostering greater intergroup tolerance for two reasons that I'll elaborate further. But for this introduction slide, the first one is that in a lot of CCE courses and programs, there is this emphasis on instilling civic values. And these civic values include respect for diversity and human rights. Another way that CCE could potentially improve intergroup tolerance is CCE being viewed as part of a nation-building project. And this idea of trying to instill greater national identification could potentially mitigate one's tendency to associate along parochial lines, such as ethnicity or religion, but rather now everyone sees each other as part of a larger, more inclusive national community. So in general, this project seeks to answer this question: does CCE, or civic and citizenship education, make individuals more accepting of those from different ethnic backgrounds? Just to give you a summary of the research design as well as the findings, I conducted two main studies. In the first study, and I think this is a study that speaks to most of the people in this group, is I look at education reform in Singapore as a kind of natural experiment to look at differences in intergroup tolerance between those who were exposed and those who were not exposed to this CCE course in Singapore. In study two, I use cross-national data, which is basically data from over 20 countries, both democratic and non-democratic, and students from those countries, and how differences in exposure to civic education leads to greater or less intergroup tolerance. In terms of the main findings, and I think as the title of this paper, this slide suggests, CCE alone does not improve ethnic tolerance. But what is, I think, even more puzzling or intriguing is that having inclusive content, and I define inclusive content as a content that emphasizes the desire to respect racial harmony or racial diversity in one's country, that emphasis alone does not make students more tolerant towards ethnic outgroups. Rather, I want to propose that pedagogy matters as well. Specifically, I argue, at least based on some preliminary analysis, that CCE improves ethnic tolerance only when it is delivered in an open and deliberative setting. However, CCE does not have any effect in environments where classroom discussions are restricted. So just to set the theoretical background, or to provide some theoretical understanding as to how CCE could affect ethnic tolerance, I think there are sort of two contrasting predictions as to that speaks to the direction of this relationship. The first, and I think the more intuitive one, is that CCE should improve ethnic tolerance. And as I mentioned earlier, many CCE programs all around the world tries to impart some sort of civic values inside and outside of the classroom. And many of these civic values include human rights, respect for diversity, resolving conflicts through peaceful channels, and so on. And you would think that exposure to these kind of civic norms and values should help students internalize these values and norms. And in turn, the internalization of these norms should lead students to exhibit greater tolerance, not only towards other ethnic outgroups, but even towards people that they may not otherwise like in their daily lives. A second potential mechanism for why CCE should improve ethnic tolerance is that CCE, and I think this is quite obvious, should be regarded as part of a larger nation-building project. And I think for many of us who's been through the Singapore public education system, CCE teaches students to view fellow citizens not as individuals from different ethnic groups, but as members of a common nation. Put simply, you don't see others as an issue of a matter of between us and them, but you see other Singaporeans now as part of a larger community. And this notion that using a larger and more inclusive community to mitigate intergroup bias speaks to a theory within psychology or social psychology, which is called the common in-group identity model. And past research, at least from this subfield within social psychology, has shown that when you expose individuals, or when you prime individuals to think along national identity lines, they're more likely to display less prejudice towards their fellow ethnic outgroup members. And so for the simple example would be, I no longer see other Singaporeans as Chinese, Malays, Indians, Eurasians, but I see everyone as one Singaporean. And so the intuition here is that exposure to CC should promote a sense of national identification, and this in turn should reduce intergroup bias. But having said that, there is also this possibility that CC should not improve ethnic tolerance as well, which is the contrasting prediction over here. And this prediction, I think, mostly stems from the fact that there's a lot of cross-national difference in terms of CC content that are delivered in schools. Put simply, many countries adopt or include different types of content in their civic and citizenship education. And this makes it very hard to generalize whether CC has any positive or even negative impact on ethnic tolerance. For example, many CC curricula, and this is not just in the US, but also in many other countries, there is an avoidance or deliberate avoidance to talk about ethnic issues. And in fact, there was a but there was a Gallup poll that asked Americans, what do you think about civic education in the US? And many people don't think of civic education as an ethnic, or don't associate ethnic issues with civic education. Rather, they think of it more as political training for future participation in the political system. There are also certain CC textbooks or curricula that seem to perpetuate certain stereotypes. For example, the model minority stereotype among Asian Americans. This is stereotype that are particularly pervasive in some American civic education textbooks. But I think even more importantly over here is that there are some countries that advocate a very exclusive version of a national identity. And this exclusive version of national identity seeks to exclude certain ethnic or domestic ethnic groups from their definition of what constitutes their national identity. And I think the classic example over here would be Myanmar, because its whole national identity is built on the Burma majority. And so when students are exposed to those kind of narratives, they are more inclined to think that, well, these domestic or other domestic ethnic outgroups, they don't belong to the national identity, so I shouldn't be displaying the same sort of affinity towards them, leading to greater exclusionary and even more prejudicial attitudes towards them. But having said that, I don't think that prediction 2 actually invalidates prediction 1. For the simple reason that you could work around prediction 2 and say that as long as you have inclusive content, you have content that talks about different ethnic groups, that covers every domestic ethnic group in a country, and talks about the importance of interracial harmony, then prediction 1 should still work. The fact that if you talk about, as long as you have inclusive content in civic and CC textbooks or curricula, then that should still have a positive impact on citizens' ethnic tolerance. So having said that, let me begin with talking about the research design in study 1. And I think for quite a number of you in this group, you might have come across social studies, which was introduced in 2001. And the cool part about this is that because it was introduced in 2001, and the fact that the academic calendar in Singapore coincides with the calendar year, you could identify who received social studies based simply on citizens' birth dates. Another important reason why Singapore seems like a very interesting case is this also speaks to the previous theoretical underpinnings that I was trying to suggest over here, that Singapore represents a most likely case to observe a positive impact of citizenship education on ethnic tolerance. Given that there is quite a pervasive coverage of ethnic issues in the social studies textbooks, you would imagine that such coverage should in turn lead to greater tolerance towards other racial and ethnic groups in Singapore. In study 2, and this is something that I will breeze through quite quickly over here, is that this is just a cross-national analysis of a large data set with over 90,000 students spread over 24 countries over many different regions. So let's talk about the education reform in Singapore. So MOE introduced social studies as a compulsory O-level subject in 2001. And I think most of you are familiar that social studies was not a standalone subject, but it was taught together with an elective. So it could be geography elective, or it could be history or literature elective. And these 2 books were the first version. Why I know this? Well, because I was actually the first cohort of affected students. And so now I guess I'm giving away my age. But having said that, I think what is important is that you could identify who received or who were exposed to social studies or this new subject based simply on a person's date of birth. In terms of exposure, duration, and length, all upper secondary students studied social studies for a minimum of 2 years. So if you're on the express course, then express special, it will be 2 years. If it's a normal academic course, it will be 3 years, with about 2 35-minute classes per week. So it seems spread over 2 years, it seems like quite a considerable amount of exposure to social studies. The other thing I want to talk about is that race is quite a salient issue that's covered in social studies textbooks. And here, I'm just going to focus on the first edition of the textbooks. And I understand that there have been multiple revisions to the textbooks over many years. But here, I'm just focusing on the first edition. And if you just look at the first edition, in terms of the word count, which is the left plot that you see, what the left plot indicates over here are the top 20 most commonly featured words in the textbooks. As expected, you will notice that words like Singapore, government, countries, work, they appear quite commonly or frequently in the textbooks. But I think what I also want to point you towards is that words such as groups and race are also mentioned quite a lot. And if you can recall, for some of you who took the subject, you recall that race was quite an important issue that's talked about in, for example, the separation between Singapore and Malaysia in 1965. There was also a chapter about the issues or the conflicts in Sri Lanka, the conflict in Northern Ireland, and also how Switzerland seems to be the epitome of intergroup harmony, and that Singaporeans should actually strive to be like the Swiss. So it seems to suggest that race and ethnic issues seem to be very prevalent in social studies textbooks. In addition, if you look at the right plot over here, the word network graph indicates what are the words that precede and follow words like communal, racial, and group. So for example, the word racial is typically followed by the word group or followed by the word harmony. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you see the word race is typically followed by riots, which is, I guess, unsurprising. And also 1964 precedes the word race. So in general, the sense we get is that the social studies textbooks in Singapore seems to place quite a heavy emphasis on fostering racial harmony among students, or the notion that racial harmony is an important feature of what makes a Singaporean citizen in the first place. So having established that, I think now I want to talk about my empirical strategy and how I compare whether there was any changes in intergroup tolerance between those who were affected and those who were not. So in 2022, October 2022, I conducted an observational survey with over 2,000 respondents. These were people who were mostly born between the years of 1976 and I believe 1995. The dependent variable over here is ethnic tolerance, which is a measure that is adapted from the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. There are 5 ethnic tolerance items that make up ethnic tolerance. So, for example, one of the items was how much do you agree that members of all ethnic groups should be encouraged to run in elections for political office? And so all these responses are later factor analyzed to create one unitary measure of ethnic tolerance for each respondent in the survey. The main explanatory variable is reform, which equals 1 if a respondent was just born on or after January 1st, 1986. As some of you might already have concluded, have already noticed that this sort of setup looks like a regression discontinuity design. And this is something I'll explain in the next slide. But insofar as this is, I think suffice it to say, I'm just looking at the difference in ethnic tolerance between respondents who were just born right before and after the cutoff. And this will be quite clear to you in the next slide. So if you look at the results over here, let's just focus on the leftmost plot over here. You see that in general, there is an increasing trend the lines seem to sort of go up over time, which suggests that ethnic tolerance actually increases as people are born later and later, which you could sort of attribute that to some sort of generational difference, right? Younger folks are generally more tolerant and less prejudicial than older folks. But what I want to point to you, or what I want to focus over here, is the cutoff at 0. Here, 0 corresponds to someone who was born on January 1st, 1986. And if you just compare those people who were born just right at the vertical line at 0, you see that there's a sharp drop in ethnic tolerance. In other words, when you compare people who are just close to the cutoff at January 1st, 1986, there is a slight decline in ethnic tolerance. And you could credibly attribute that to exposure to social studies, conditional on the fact that there were no other major education reforms that were happening at the same time that also affected people based on their birth years. And so, in summary, these 3 plots over here seem to indicate that exposure to social studies was linked to a decrease in ethnic tolerance. I'm not going to go into detail over here, but happy to talk more about the models or the model specifications in the Q&A. But insofar as suffice it to say, it seems that the reform or exposure to social studies didn't seem to have any positive impact on ethnic tolerance. The last part, the second study that I want to talk about is a cross-national study using the ICCS data, or the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. As I mentioned, these are all student-level observations or student-level surveys, and these students were nested within 3,000 over schools, and these 3,000 schools were then nested within 24 countries. The dependent variable was constructed in pretty much the same way as how it was constructed in the Singapore study. The main explanatory variables, and this is the interesting feature of the ICCS data, is that you would imagine that civic and citizenship education could be taught in a variety of modalities. So it's not only taught in the classroom, it could be taught as an extracurricular activity. So for example, in your ECS or your CCS, it could be through debate clubs or political clubs. Some schools also might argue that for them, citizenship education is a fully integrated feature of their education experience. And just to quickly run through this, for each of the different features or each of the different modality in which citizenship education was taught, there isn't a strong effect. And in fact, none of these effects seem to meet the usual or conventional statistical significance threshold, which indicates that actually citizenship education alone does not really have any strong impact or have any impact at all on ethnic tolerance. So, sort of summing everything up based on the 2 studies, what could be explaining why CCE fails to improve ethnic tolerance in the first place? Having established that that CCE could potentially improve it, this to me was surprising at the beginning. And I don't know if it was surprising to you, but it was really surprising to me when I looked at the data. But then I probed further and tried to figure out what are some of the additional variables that I am missing, or additional variables that I'm missing, which could provide a more complete picture. In general, I think the first thing I could say, at least based on the analysis, is that having inclusive content alone does not make students more tolerant. And this is especially true in the Singapore case study. But what the theory or the theoretical underpinnings that I mentioned earlier in this presentation hasn't taken into account the role of pedagogy. And in fact, there is also a rich separate set of literature that looks at how open classrooms in civics instruction, as compared to other traditional modes of instruction, can foster greater political engagement and knowledge. To be specific, an open classroom or an open classroom climate is defined as an environment where students experience their classrooms as places to investigate issues and explore their opinions and those of their peers. And so it would seem to suggest that having an open room climate should amplify or should help to make CC's impact more positive over here, because it helps to promote exchange of students' lived experiences, especially those who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and also an open discussion of contemporary socio-political issues. So in the first study, in the Singapore case study, although I do not have any definitive or strong evidence, based on anecdotal evidence, especially research that's done by Li Ching in the past, it seems that perhaps the now effect that we observe may stem from the lack of classroom openness. I think it is clear, at least based on my own personal experience, that a lot of the teaching on social studies during my time were based on the idea that this was a subject that was compulsory at the O levels. And so a lot of teachers just emphasized on teaching to the test rather than trying to embrace more open discussions during the classroom sessions. There is also this fear of retaliation, especially for teachers and educators who fear that inviting more open discussions could risk their professional opportunities and career advancements in the future. And so most of them just stuck to the narratives that were already mentioned in the textbooks. And in fact, Li Ching, in her 2010 paper, mentioned that no students ever expressed the need that there was a need to address any systemic or institutional racism in Singapore, which I guess speaks to either A, they really think that there isn't, or B, it's pure ignorance. So yeah. Now, coming to study two, and I think this is the slightly more interesting part, is that in the ICCS data, there is a measure of classroom openness. Classroom openness over here is based on students' perceptions of how open their classroom discussions are, especially on political and social issues. And so what I did was to create a score or a measure of classroom openness based on these students' opinions and interact that in my regression models. And what you'll notice over here, and I think I'll just go through really quickly, if you see, for example, on the left plot, and if you look at the leftmost extreme point, you see that at the lowest level of classroom openness, civic and citizenship education has no effect whatsoever on ethnic tolerance. But as you increase the level of classroom openness, what it seems to suggest based on the result is that civic and citizenship education starts to have a slightly more positive effect. That means it starts to have a more salutary effect on ethnic tolerance. Students become more tolerant and less prejudicial towards other ethnic groups when they are not only exposed to civic and citizenship education, but this is delivered in an open classroom climate. So just to conclude, and I think this is about the right amount of time, two main findings. I think first is that CC alone does not improve ethnic tolerance. And two, CC only improves ethnic tolerance when it is delivered in a classroom climate. And this speaks to, I think, one facet of political science research, not so much education research, that pedagogy has been pretty much ignored in a lot of the political science work that I'm mostly engaged with. The next step in this research, and as I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, this is a work in progress. And so there's an additional step that I want to look at, which is whether ethnic diversity in the classroom enhances the effectiveness of CCE programs like how open classrooms do. So in the Singapore case study, I actually collected data on the schools that students attended in the past. And so I could potentially partition out, I could compare between students who attended SEP schools, which are just pure all Chinese schools, versus non-SEP schools, and see whether the effect of citizenship or social studies differed between these two groups of students. In terms of contributions, this project highlights the specific conditions in which CCE programs can be effective in improving ethnic tolerance. But I think more importantly, it also highlights the importance of pedagogy in education politics literature, which is something that hitherto up to today hasn't been thoroughly explored or investigated. And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And so to kick off the discussion, I'd like to welcome Professor Ho Li Ching to give initial thoughts on Jeremy's presentation. And Jeremy, if you could unshare your screen, great, wonderful. Li Ching, turn on your mic and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy, for that fascinating paper. I was kind of like pleased to hear that you were part of that first cohort, because I was the first cohort of teachers to actually teach that curriculum. So I was a social studies teacher at a secondary school in Singapore during this time of transition, and if I may say, somewhat of angst as well. So that's a tiny bit of coincidence here. So anyway, it's a fascinating paper, and I'm glad that I had this opportunity to read it. It's a timely topic that addresses a perennial issue that's really close to my heart. I look at this issue from the lens of a civic education scholar. So I'm less immersed in the political science literature, although there is significant amount of overlap. And I'm actually really glad that Jeremy reminds us that about the importance of pedagogy and how it is crucial to make that distinction, as Elliot Eisner talks about, between the formal and intended curriculum, as well as the enacted curriculum and the received curriculum on the part of students. It is also really hard in education, especially, to make causal connections, and it's really difficult to isolate impact of various dimensions of the education system. So, for example, you not only have to look at formal curriculum materials, you need to look at assessment. So what is the nature of assessment and how does that affect the instruction in the classroom? Think about pedagogy. You got to think about teachers' beliefs, students' beliefs, the ages of students, school administrative structures, curriculum making at different levels, as Deng reminds us. So it is really hard, and Jeremy has set himself a huge task in terms of an ambitious work. So I like to congratulate him on that. So the paper is excellent. I strongly encourage everyone to read it. I do have a couple of suggestions that I hope that he might want to think about addressing as he moves on with this work, this really important work that's as I said before, is very close to my heart. So I would like Jeremy to consider doing a deeper dive into the nature of the content in the curriculum. So while it's a good first step to look at whether there is a presence of inclusive content, in other words, did it use these key phrases? Does it exclude any ethnic group, things like that? But it might be worth considering how these issues are framed in the curriculum. So it's not whether they are present or not, like is the word harmony present or not, but how is that concept addressed and highlighted in the curriculum? Because this can have implications for how these issues or topics are introduced in the classroom and how these issues or topics are received by the students themselves. So irrespective of pedagogy. So just thinking about curriculum itself, right? And there's been numerous studies done by some of my colleagues in Singapore and myself and we have written about problematic characterizations of diversity in the curriculum, critiqued this particular version of the curriculum because it's the first one. For example, some of us have written about how the notion of harmony has been introduced in a way that's very limited and very thin. The perception of diversity as being problematic, that dissent is harmful. So yes, while these topics are introduced in the curriculum, how it's framed really makes a difference. It's also important to consider who these students are. I mean, in terms of, and how this curriculum might or might not align with students' lived experiences and understandings. For example, in the US, there have been studies that have shown that students reject national historical narratives, in part because they are white dominated, and these students of color have experiences that contradict these national narratives. So it's possible that students' lived experiences and understandings might also result in them rejecting it. Just one final note of which is a minor issue. The social studies curriculum that you highlighted, as you mentioned, was basically targeted at students taking O levels. In other words, students in the express as well as in the normal academic. But the normal tech students did not take it, and that's a quarter to a third of each cohort, as well as the students in the independent schools. So it is a large proportion of that cohort, but not everyone. Just to note that as well. But otherwise, I think this is an excellent piece of work, and I strongly encourage you to continue working on it. And thank you again for inviting me to provide these remarks.
Thank you, Li Ching. I'm going to pick up on one point that you raised regarding the content, the substance of the CC curriculum, and link it to a comment made by Ian Chong of Academia SG in the chat. And perhaps Joshua, Jeremy, you could reply to them together. Also regarding content, Ian also asked, I'm curious whether the content of CC matters, either controlling for pedagogy or an interaction pedagogy. You can read the rest of his comment here. He highlights in particular the fact that the CC in Singapore tends to emphasize the CMIO racial categories of Singapore citizens, and conveniently kind of leaving aside the fact that there are a large number of low-wage migrant workers that don't seem to figure into discussions of racial harmony. So would you like to take that point that has been raised, that question has been raised by Prof. Ho and Ian as well, about the content of CC curriculum?
Sure. I think, so in the survey that I conducted, I also asked questions about migrants, attitudes towards migrants, which I didn't mention in the paper nor in the slides, but just a precursor, I don't see any significant effect as well. So basically, you know, reading social studies didn't improve, nor did it decrease immigrant tolerance, put it this way. So I think that content, I think, matters, but I think it's still very contingent on several other indicators as well. And I think as the slides, as the presentation suggests, it is also contingent on how, like Li Ching mentioned, how this was also practiced in terms of pedagogy, but also how it was received by students as well. So I think that's sort of my answer to I don't know if that's satisfactory enough, but that's how I would imagine content, how that would matter.
Is there anything else you'd like to pick up on from Li Ching's comments? If not, we can move on to other questions.
Just one small thing. So I take whatever your suggestions you mentioned earlier, and I really appreciate those feedback. And I think it was really helpful in my preliminary stages of drafting that I referred to a lot of the Singapore scholars or local scholars who wrote about this topic. The one thing I just want to sort of talk about is that in the survey, you mentioned about normal tech students as well as independent schools. Normal tech students, I excluded them from my analysis. So the people in the analysis are just for normal acad and express students. For independent schools, so I came from an independent school. We had to take it. I would imagine most other independent schools had to take it. That's my impression. So because at the end of the day, most of the independent schools, and I think this only applies to maybe my cohort, because most of us, we didn't have the IB option, which became more pervasive or prevalent among later cohorts. So I would imagine that they would still have to take the same set of subjects, at least in the initial few cohorts. And correct me if I'm wrong over here.
I think it might vary by school. The characteristic of an independent school is that teachers have the flexibility of introducing new materials, additional readings, things like that, new concepts to their students, and they don't have to adhere to the national curriculum so closely. And it's also the structure of the independent school, because you're not subject to the O-level exams either. Right. So your teachers have flexibility to bring in other things within reason.
I could also now raise another point that Li Ching made that is so important, which is to use my own words, I guess, what happens in the classroom does not happen within a hermetically sealed environment, right? There are all kinds of influences beyond the classroom, and it's impossible really to figure out what exactly is the explanation for any findings that you uncover. I'm particularly interested in knowing whether you took into account the possible impact of 9/11, because the thing about 2001, of course, is this huge event that did reverberate in Singapore. Impressionistically, at least, I would say that that was a time associated with far greater salience of race and religion. And not in a good way, right? There was an increase of distrust as a result of those events and the attempted attack on Singapore, successful attacks in Indonesia and so on. It was a historic period. So there is a cohort effect to be taken into account. And I wonder how you deal with that in your study.
So unfortunately, in terms of cohort, sort of some extraneous cohort effects, I think those are a lot harder to control for. But speaking about the 9/11, it's funny you talked about this, because I also received the exact same comment from someone else prior to this seminar. But as far as I can recall, based on my own experience, I don't remember that 9/11 was talked about as much in the classroom, especially during social studies. Maybe some other classes, but I would imagine a stronger cohort effect would be that those who were born in the year of 1986, they are born in the year of Tiger. And if you remember, this was the year where birth rate was especially low. This was also the year where a lot of the teachers shared candidly when I was in Sec 3, Sec 4, that we were unfortunately not the smartest bunch. And so we were sort of labeled as such. And so maybe there is some stigma attached to that cohort. But that's just on my own personal experience. I can't generalize it to the rest, but that's one possibility. And also the year of Tiger is not a very auspicious year. So maybe that could be, I don't know, but
Yeah, I wouldn't expect 9/11 to be explicitly discussed in the classroom in the same way that it is now kind of almost too sensitive to talk about Gaza in the classroom. But what I'm suggesting is that it was in the air. And of course, if you were in your teens at that point, you might not appreciate directly, right, firsthand, what a change in the air that was. But I think those of us who are older, right, can tell the difference that issues came onto the agenda in a much more forceful way, surfaced everywhere, in the news, in what journalists were talking about, what politicians were talking about. It's been associated with the securitization of everything. This was a war on terror. Everyone had to get involved, and you could not, because of the nature of 9/11, you could not avoid this, this very strong impulse to look at those events through a religious or ethnic lens. So I think that may be something that is worth thinking about as you develop this study. Let me go back to questions though, and pick up on who do we have? Let's see. Ryan Lee, a question which may have already been addressed, but is it is it that places with more open discussions are also more ethnically tolerant to begin with, and hence likely to have those open discussions? Which I think is an interesting observation about the fact that, the cause could be the effect, or the effect could be the cause, right? Would you like to take that question on?
So this is a fascinating question. I think one way you can think about this is, for example, there's going to be, I guess you can presume that there should be a lot more openness in more democratic regimes as opposed to more authoritarian regimes. And this is something that I haven't explored yet, but this is sort of the next step, which is using the sort of international data and comparing the effects of civic education on ethnic tolerance, but sort of cutting it between democracies and autocracies. Because that could put, if you do see differential effects, then you could, I guess, possibly attribute that to there's going to be a lot more self-censorship in autocracies and authoritarian regimes, and maybe that lack of discussion and openness could contribute to greater intolerance in authoritarian regimes as opposed to democracies. That could be one way to, I guess, address this question. I don't know if that's a satisfactory one.
Yeah, I'm wondering, in your cross-national study, have you separated democracies from less democratic societies and so on? Have you done that analysis yet?
No, I haven't. That's like the next immediate step. In fact, I got a couple of comments in Chicago and in other conferences. So this is the next immediate step. In fact, one of the countries that were sampled in the data was Russia, and this was Russia in 2016. And so you would imagine that they could possibly be, I guess, the authoritarian example in the comparison part.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, of course, one way in which the level of democracy might affect the delivery of CC would be in terms of whether these open discussions are possible, right? But the other way, of course, would be that the less democratic the society, the higher the chances are that the education agenda will be captured by politicians, and in fact not be implemented as much by professional educators, but instead used very cynically, but I guess in their minds very idealistically, to pursue certain political agendas. So for example, if you have ethnic nationalist party or parties that are highly racial, and if the system does not have sufficient separation of powers to insulate the educational administrators and professional educators from the pressure from politicians, it's very likely then, of course, that one of the first things they would do, I would imagine, a political party that has this kind of ethnic nationalist vision would be precisely to interfere in CCE, right? So I'd be very interested to see if that is indeed the case. I would expect that would be the case.
Yes, absolutely right. In fact, I think the sort of comparison between authoritarianism and democracy is, I guess, will be considered as sort of a bundle, because like within authoritarianism, there's the bundle of self-censorship as well as elite capture of education system. And so I think in the next step, I need to more clearly specify which part of these things or factors are actually influencing the distinction between authoritarianism and democracies, and how that also translates to how civic education is being delivered, and how that in turn affects ethnic tolerance.
Right. And bringing up the point that was raised by Ryan Lee and about precedent causes, right? Maybe I could throw in another point, which is that I'd be very curious about whether colonialism makes a difference. If you think about the British strategy of divide and rule, which some have called define and which was very deliberately to prevent any kind of cross identity nation building and instead to reify race. If an independent country is born with that so-called DNA, it's very difficult to shake off, right? There's a very high chance that education too will be racialized. It'll be very difficult to insert the kind of values that you're referring to, civic values, human rights values, if nation building was already racialized.
Yeah, this is a fascinating comment about colonialism. I have to check again the sample of countries that were covered. I'm not entirely sure which were the countries that had a long or had some sort of colonial legacy in the past, but definitely we'll delve into that as well.
Ian Chong has a couple of other comments. One is a suggestion that you could throw in VDEM scores, that's for the Varieties of Democracy Institute, the detailed quantitative analyses of different countries, and that might get some more granularity, add some granularity to your findings. Let me next. I like the start of this comment from Su Keng Gan. I'm very concerned. You caught me already. So, Su Keng Gan says, I'm very concerned. Nobody mentions what possible values contribute to cultivating and sustaining ethnic tolerance in a human being. What about the values of loving kindness and compassion, based on inclusivity, curiosity to explore, and being non-judgmental? If such values are not in the civic education pedagogy content, then we are missing the feelings of heart and only intellectualizing the topic without human emotions. My apology if my views are not in tune with the speaker and academic audience. Thanks for allowing my sharing. I think, in spite of us being academics, I think we can this comment goes to the core, I'm sure, of our concerns. I wonder if Lee Ching, you want to respond to that, and then Jeremy.
Yes, I think this is such an important point because there's traditionally been a lot of focus in terms of a more abstract, dispassionate mode of communication, as well as thinking about the curriculum. My more recent work has actually focused on how can we help students extend their somewhat incipient senses of empathy and compassion to distant others. And by distant others, I mean not only people who are geographically distant, but also people who are socially distant from us. And that is a huge challenge, in my opinion, for civic educators. So bringing in that idea of emotion into what has traditionally been very somewhat abstract and dispassionate way of approaching teaching and education more broadly is something that we have been grappling with, we meaning my colleagues and I.
Yeah, I think Su Keng Gan, I mean, just to add to what Prof. Ho says, I think that there's, across the social sciences, there's what we call an affective turn, the recognition that emotions matter. I know in political science, I'm not a political science myself, but I'm familiar enough with some of the some readings, perhaps on the fringe, I don't know, that says that, for all the philosophizing about what makes for democracy, what makes for tolerance, the missing link has always been, well, okay, it works in theory, but why should I be moved to do that? And there are even those who say that actually that's the role of religion, that we need something as emotional as religion to give us the motivation to actually try to develop ourselves as citizens. So these are indeed fascinating issues. Jeremy, how would you respond to Su Keng Gan?
So I was also going to say the same thing, but Li Ching stole my thunder. I was going to say, teachers are supposed to be disinterested and supposed to be neutral. And I think a lot of the local scholars, when they covered how teachers, social studies teachers try to teach the subject. They try to do that in a very dispassionate, neutral stance, and I don't see that there's anything wrong with that. And I think, but I think there's absolutely an important role that emotion, empathy, and perspective taking can play in the education system. And in fact, I think more of my more recent research looks at how language could play that role in trying to make people more empathetic or empathic towards other viewpoints. And so I think emotions still could play an important role, but I think it is still kind of lacking some sort of attention, I think, in not only in political science literature, but also I think in education research to some degree as well.
I'm going to go back up the question list in case there are questions that we missed. Again, from Ian, whether you've passed the findings in terms of ethnic group, family income, gender in Singapore as well as in the cross-national research.
Cross-national research, I have to dig back again. I can't remember offhand what impact it has. So I can't give you an answer right now. I have to check back again.
What about your Singapore data? Do answers vary depending on race, income, gender?
Yeah, for Singapore, that I can remember because I was very surprised with the social studies, and then I looked at the rest just to make sure. So race, I think, is intuitive. Chinese in general, being the majority group, tend to be less tolerant than other racial groups in Singapore. Income, there isn't a very strong effect or relationship. Income, I mean, it's still the usual suspect that low income tend to be slightly more prejudicial. But it's not the effect or the relationship, the coefficient isn't very large here. Gender, there wasn't any difference, which to me was quite striking because I thought that there might be some sort of gender difference, but apparently, at least in the Singapore context, as far as I can remember, there isn't a very strong gender difference towards ethnic tolerance.
Li Ching, do you want to chip in based on your, even if not done direct research on it, what would your hunches be in terms of how gender, income level, and race might affect how CC is received?
So my work isn't I don't deal with large data sets. I do it more qualitative, small scale studies. But I've actually done my work in various school settings with different profiles of students and across academic tracks or streams. So I can infer a little bit based on that, but it's really hard to make broad generalizations. I think some of my work has highlighted the difference in terms of sense of civic agency across academic streams or tracks. So in other words, students in the vocational tracks, feel a lower sense of political efficacy or belief that they can actually effect any change in their circumstances, either within the school or in the larger society, compared to that of students in perhaps the more academic tracks. So there is a difference. And in Singapore, we know that there is a strong correlation between SES profile of students in each academic track. So this is somewhat indirect, but it gives us a sense.
That's a socioeconomic status. Okay, and which direction?
So the students students from higher SES are overrepresented in the more elite academic tracks. Yes. So As a result, these students also express a greater sense of political efficacy, a belief that they can effect change, that they have this power to make a difference, or at least greater than that of other students in other tracks.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much. I mean, this is, I sense that because of the richness of the topic, we've only scratched the surface of it, but scratched it very expertly. So I want to thank both Jeremy and Li Ching for contributing to wonderful discussion about CCE, its limitations as well as its potential. Thanks very much for completing this, for offering to talk about your research at our Junior Scholar seminar series. Congratulations on defending your Ph.D. and we look forward to hearing more of the great work that you're doing. So thank you all. And thanks, of course, to the audience as well.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Charon and Academia SG, for inviting me to talk about my project. Thanks.